Well, hello everyone. Thanks again for joining another All Things Avennia. My name's Eli Travers, and today is Earth Day. So happy Earth Day to everyone. I thought it was an appropriate day to talk about climate change and tackle this huge field of information, data, misinformation, and lots of things, and how it relates to the wine industry. So without further ado, we're going to get started because I have quite a bit of information to share with you, and then we'll go into just sort of a normal discussion type part of the session, and you guys can ask all the questions that you have. So climate change and wine. This is inarguably, the story of our time. But I wanted to talk today about how it relates to the wine industry as a whole, not just for us here at Avennia and for Washington, but really the world over and what people are dealing with. So the first background is just about Earth Day. For those of you that don't know about Earth Day or where it comes from, I just found it pretty interesting. So in the decades following World War II, levels of smog and water pollution, the amount of chemicals and pesticides used all over the place skyrocketed. Industry was really booming. There was a lot of just energy and a lot of consumption and really growing industries for the first time in the way that they were. So that by the 60s, you started seeing some sort of backlash and some sort of paying attention to the environment at large. So in 1962 is when Rachel Carson publishes the book Silent Spring about the dangers of pesticides. This is what got DDT out of the way for a lot of for America and for the world, and to keep our air less polluted. And the book also inspired citizens for the first time to be stewards of the living earth and really start this environmental movement. And obviously the 60s had a lot of movements. This was a time when there was a lot of protests, a lot of social upheaval, and just people really latching onto bigger and grander ideas. And so in the later part of the decade, in 1969, there was a few things that happened that were really sparks for action. One of them being the Santa Barbara oil spill, which at the time was the largest oil spill in U.S. history. Since then, it's been eclipsed by the Valdez and the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf. But that was a big deal, and it really got a lot of attention. And then also the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire. Again, this was something a lot of people at the time thought this was a one-off event, and how terrible the water was so polluted with runoff from the steel mills that it caught fire. But it had happened almost a dozen times over the preceding decades. But it caught fire again. It just happened to coincide with this level of interest and people paying attention. So that Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin and then a Republican Representative Pete McCloskey wanted to act and do something. So they organized actually a campus teach-in and relied on college students, because at the time a lot of the anti-war protests for Vietnam War and a lot of the protest movement in general was driven by college students. So they got Dennis Hayes to lead the charge. He recruited staff, over 80 people all over the US, to organize, to do a teach-in about environmentalism, about these issues. And they chose April 22nd as the day because it was kind of between spring break and final exams, so they thought they could get the most participation from their fellow students. And they also renamed it Earth Day, and this is what the media took on and really made it spread and draw a lot more interest. So that by the time they executed it on April 22nd in 1970, this was the first Earth Day, and it drew 20 million Americans. And at the time, this was about 10% of the population. And that's important because there's these theories about the kind of engagement you need from the public or from protest in order to enact change. And there's kind of this 3.5% rule. I've also heard 5%. But basically, there's a certain amount, if a certain percentage of the population cares about something enough to go out and protest and march and say something, that usually will enact change. Throughout history, that's happened with many different movements. So 10% definitely said something. And so that same year, the Nixon administration created the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency. And they also passed a lot of different laws, environmental laws, including the Clean Water Act. A couple of years later was the Clean Air, or I might have got that switched around. Endangered Species Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Acts, a lot of things that were really focused on environmentalism. So the first Earth Day was a great success. and it's been going on ever since. But to take a look, we're going to zoom back now. So we've talked about Earth Day, but I want to really quickly go through some of the very basic timeline of climate change or global warming and how this has developed over time. Um, and so you guys know I love history, so we're just going to zoom right on through this. So the latter part of the 19th century. So this is what, when a lot of climatologists and people in the business of talking about climate change, we'll talk about pre-industrial levels of carbon in the atmosphere or pre-industrial global temperatures. This is what they're talking about. The period between 1850 and 1900 is when they really started having enough measurements of temperature in certain environmental data all across the world that they could rely on. And at this time, they could measure that the global average temperature was 13.7 degrees Celsius. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 290. And that's sort of what everything is based on as far as pre-industrial levels. Then we have the Industrial Revolution. So through the latter part of the 1800s and into the 1900s, industry took off. There was think about Henry Ford and assembly lines, and just really America led the way as far as industry goes. And then by the 20s, when fossil fuels were more in demand, we had the Permian Basin and parts of Texas open up to more oil. The Persian Gulf opened up, and so we had more cheap sources of energy, and so industry just continued skyrocketing and booming. But because of that, our emissions also started skyrocketing. So that by the 1960s, we were already up in our global temperature by a couple tenths of a percent and some more carbon. Like I said earlier, the 70s is when we get Earth Day and a little more focus on environmentalism. And then the 80s were really important. This is where we start seeing kind of the splits. The Reagan administration is really starts steering political conservatism towards skepticism. So this is when we get a lot of people going up against global warming or some of the science behind it. And but at the same time, you still had a lot of people seeing the seriousness of it and measuring this and realizing that we had to pay attention. So that by 1988, the famous physicist James Hansen from NASA testifies before Congress about global warming, and it's televised, and this is something that media latches onto again and creates a lot more buzz about the issue. So that same year, the UN established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. We'll talk about that a little bit more, because they're the ones that come out with the reports. But because of this new focus on the seriousness of climate change and global warming, the Global Climate Coalition was formed. And this was actually a coalition of both fossil fuel companies, lobbyists, and other industries that relied on fossil fuels or relied on some of those energy sources, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce actually was involved in this coalition. And they were formed basically to combat the messaging, or to try to sow doubt about global warming or about climate change. And they really wanted to make sure that new laws weren't enacted in order to reduce emissions all over the world. So they were big in combating the Kyoto Protocol and just other global efforts to combat climate change. So in the 90s, Earth Day at this point reaches the world. It mobilizes around 200 million people in 141 countries. It really starts gaining speed. We get our first IPCC reports that basically confirm that the Earth has been warming and will continue so, and that it's very likely human caused, and that they figured out that it's definitely because of our impact on the climate that is warming at the rate it is. Like I said, the Kyoto Protocol in Japan was the first multinational agreement of sorts to reduce carbon emissions. At this time, the Senate in the US had already decided they weren't going to ratify it, so the US was not part of it. It actually wasn't until 2003, when Russia came on board, that they had enough countries involved to meet the threshold to enact all the policies they created at the Kyoto Protocol. So that wasn't until 2005 that a lot of these European nations, Japan, and other places around the world started reducing emissions, or at least trying to. 2001 is when that third IPCC report comes out that really just makes it even more clear that global warming is unprecedented. It's actually happening. This is the same year that the Climate Global Coalition disbands. At this point, there's enough evidence that they don't really have the membership available to fight it anymore. And then fast forward a few years later, we have Al Gore and the Inconvenient Truth, which was great in a lot of reasons. It brought this message to a lot more people, but at the same time, it kind of inconveniently made it more of a political issue. Because of his experience and being a Democratic vice president and almost president, that it made it almost more of a political issue than it had been in the past. Or when Reagan was here, it was kind of like furthered that wedge. IPCC keeps coming out with more proof that this is really happening. There's another conference in Copenhagen that tries to get multinational support for reducing emissions that actually doesn't work. And then there's a lot of talk about trying to install nuclear power and revitalizing that option for renewable sources. But the Fukushima incident in Japan kind of put a kibosh on that. And then we have the Paris Agreement. So 2015, when nearly all countries pledged to reduce emissions, which we eventually left and then just re-entered. And these are great. A lot of these multinational agreements are good on the surface because it shows that there's interest, but it actually didn't really do much. There wasn't any binding solution or binding agreements on how to reduce emissions. And then 2018, the latest IPCC report was probably the most serious of the lot, and really got a lot of media attention. There's been a lot of articles written and a lot more momentum to address this now that we know that really we need to make some big changes by 2030 in order to avoid some of this disastrous warming. And then obviously you can see by now we are over a degree Celsius of warming from pre-industrial levels. Our carbon in the atmosphere has reached 415 parts per million when they say about 350 should be the safe level of carbon in the atmosphere. So it's a very serious thing. This is definitely something that we should all be paying attention to. And Earth Day is the kind of day to really think about it and talk about it. And now Earth Day is recognized as the largest secular observance in the world because over 1 billion people participate in some way. This is our participation. So thank you for participating in our Earth Day this year. So let's talk about wine. So I'm sorry I had to just rush through all that history of climate and how we've been talking about, but let's talk more about the wine business. So we'll talk about the major ways climate change affects viniculture, primarily viniculture, but also we'll talk a little bit about the winemaking specifically, and then the wine business or the industry at large. So the main challenges, and we'll expand on all of these, is that temperature rise. So the rising temperature means we have hotter growing seasons. We also have warmer winters, which can encourage pests and diseases, among other things. We have more extended periods of droughts, which can fuel wildfires, makes irrigation necessary, and water rights a tricky issue for certain parts of the world. And then we also have some more extreme weather events or more natural disasters. And this can be hail, frost, hurricanes, and the like. And we'll go through each one. We'll start with drought. So what is drought? It's a prolonged shortage of water supply. But interestingly, it's not just water like rain or precipitation from the sky. It very much also means surface water or groundwater. Because in periods of drought, it's not just preventing clouds from making rain and raining down, but it's also evaporating any of the moisture that's in the soil already. And that's where you get those cracks in the ground in really dry soil. This can last weeks, months, honestly, even decades. Right now, the Western U.S. has officially been in a drought period since the year 2000, which is not good. And the increase in temperature, like I said, causes water evaporation from soils. But that evaporation, and again, evaporation over bodies of water like oceans, there is more moisture in the atmosphere. So you'd think that, oh, well, then there's more moisture in the atmosphere, that means there's more rain. And that's true. There are more intense rainstorms, but they're just in different places. And when you have more intense rain in other places, you get more intense droughts and unpredictable weather patterns in the other areas. So what are they doing? What are wineries and vineyards doing to combat drought or to deal with it? So a big thing, obviously, is irrigation. Irrigation, obviously, it depends on your access to water. There's a lot of places where you might not have the aquifers um, readily available, or reservoirs that you could rely on, or other sources of water like nearby rivers. But most places have some sort of source of water in order to irrigate. And there's these two kinds of irrigation that they've used in Australia for a few years now, which because Australia has also been in an extended drought period. And I think they're kind of interesting. There's the partial root zone drying, or PRD, which is when you literally just alternate which side of the vines you're watering every other day or every other time you do add water. And it's a way to reduce your water use by 50%, so it saves a lot more water, and it can stress the vine out enough so that the roots are still digging a little deeper. They're trying to find that water source, but you're also not killing the plant. The other thing they use is regulated deficit irrigation, which is basically preventing irrigation during certain parts of the plant growth, but also using water when you absolutely need it, like during fruit set or different parts of the vine's growth period. Another big thing they do is using drought-resistant rootstocks. So most vineyards and vines are planted in or grafted onto different rootstocks. The rootstocks being from a different species of vine or a different species of grape. But a lot of these rootstocks can have qualities that will help mitigate drought or help resist drought. Part of that too is actually salt tolerant. This is something I just learned, that when you don't have rain and things washing away salt and other things in the soil, the salinity of the soil can increase, which can usually be detrimental for vines. And so having rootstocks that are more adaptable to salt helps in drought situations. Another thing you can do is adding cover crops or other organic material in between your vines. This just increases soil moisture holding capacity, so that when it does rain or when you do add water through irrigation, more of it can stay near the surface or near the vines because there's more organic material using it. And then you can also use other technologies like thermal imaging. There's lots of different gadgets and remote sensors you can use to measure things throughout the season. But then droughts also add to wildfires. So wildfires are a big issue, and obviously if you've paid attention to the news in the last couple of years, Napa, Oregon, BC, Washington, all over the West Coast, and then absolutely in Australia, different places in Southeast Asia. There's been some, even southern France, there's been some really bad wildfires in vineyard areas. So what are wildfires? Just by definition, these are any uncontrolled fire that spreads across wildland. And that can be any kind of wildland. And they can be started naturally, like lightning, or by humans. Most of the time, though, these are started by humans. Globally, like at least the average globally is that only 4% of wildfires are started naturally. So these are mostly, whether it's through arson or through power lines or any sort of human interaction with the forest, that's how these wildfires are started. In the US, 84% are started by humans. And then how does climate change make it worse? So when we have rising temperature, one of the main things it also affects is snowpack, or how much snow we get during the winter. And it's important because, especially in these wine regions that might be close to tall mountains that get a lot of snow and that rely on some snow runoff or some snow melt in the spring, the less snow you have means that the earlier the forests are going to dry out. And the earlier the forests dry out, it prolongs the period of time where they could become fuel for a fire. And so the drier the forests are, and this is happening, 4 weeks sooner than in previous decades that snow is melting. So our fire seasons are just longer in general. And then when they do catch, when the human error or lightning strikes and we do have wildfires and they spark, they just last a long time. They're really hard to control. And then they also add more carbon into the atmosphere, which furthers that cycle of warming temperature, less snow, drier fuel, catches fire, more carbon, more warming. So what are some of the solutions? There are things you can do to help adapt or to mitigate wildfires. The big thing is to remove fuel sources. This is the same idea in any forestry, whether it's controlled burns or just minimizing how much combustible material is around your vineyard. So a lot of vineyard management manuals will talk about creating a buffer zone and clearing any debris you have around your vineyard, cleaning any debris from your structures, so your winery, your roof, your gutters, anything that could burn, get rid of it. Have this 30 to 50 feet vegetation, this ban around your property. A lot of sustainable wineries are using sheep or goats in order to get rid of a lot of that fuel, which is great. You can also mulch or cut that vegetation and scatter it, which can reduce the fire intensity or the flame height. And then you can also add moisture. A lot of vineyards don't end up actually burning per se. They don't. The vines themselves won't catch fire because there's enough moisture usually around them. But you can help by adding some water and irrigating before fire happens. Obviously, you'd want to check with the fire departments to make sure you're not stealing precious resources from them. But that's something to do. And there is evidence too that plastic irrigation lines. So if you have drip irrigation with plastic, they have been shown that those can ignite, that those can catch on fire. They can melt against the vine and damage vines as well. So there's a lot of movement towards replacing with steel pipes or some other infrastructure that has less plastic. And honestly, one of the things you'll see that comes up more often than not is prey. That a lot of times you just have no control over these weather events and these extreme natural disasters. So a lot of winemakers and growers are just praying it doesn't happen to them. But so let's talk about smoke taint real quick. So one of the main issues on the wine side, so not just vineyards and the structures and grapes, but like how does it affect the wine? And smoke taint is a big thing. We're still doing a lot of research and trying to figure out why it happens, how it happens, and how to prevent it or deal with it when we do have smoke taint. But basically, this is what we know so far. So grapes, most likely, grapes are susceptible to smoke taint in the period between veraison and harvest, or veraison and harvest, when the berries have already turned purple or yellow and they're ready. They're developing in that final stage. There are some studies that show that it has affected grapes before veraison in Australia when they're more pea-sized and really hard and green. So there's obviously more research that needs to be done. It's very well possible that it could affect a vine at any point during the growing season. But what happens is you have smoke particles that can be absorbed through the grape skin or through the leaves. And the grape skin is usually what's more worrisome or is a little harder to treat. If it goes through the leaves, there's not enough research that says it's transferred into the fruit from the leaves, like from that process. But there's a few things you can try to do. You can wash the fruit if there's a notable ash layer. Like say it's right before harvest and there's ash or something or soot that comes from a wildfire on your grapes. You can wash that and that might help. But washing the fruit is not going to get rid of smoke taint when it's already in the skins, because it really soaks into the skin structure, into the phenolics. And a lot of times you won't even know that there's smoke taint there, and you need to send those out to a lab in order to get that measured. And a lot of times that's also hard because there's a period of time before you'll get those lab results when you already have to decide if you're processing that fruit or purchasing that fruit that might be smoke tainted. So it's just a really, really hard thing to deal with at that time. There are methods of finding and filtrating some of those particles, the larger smoke particles, but still there's no fail-safe way of doing it. There's no way to completely eliminate smoke taint from the wine as of yet. But obviously there is a lot of research being done now, particularly because the last few years we've had some of the worst fires in Napa and in California and some of these places where a lot of wine is being made. So heat waves or heat spikes is another issue. What are they? They're just prolonged periods of excessively hot weather they may or may not have high humidity, but just the temperature in general is what we're worried about. And how does climate change make it worse? Obviously, the temperatures are rising, so it just makes it a more common occurrence. Heat waves and heat spikes are happening more often now than they were decades ago. They can exacerbate droughts and wildfire, which we've already talked about. And they also prevent cooler night temperatures. We've talked before about diurnal shifts and the difference between a hot day and a cool night and how important that is for grapevines. And when we don't have those cooler nights because of these heat spikes or heat waves, that can lead to overripe grapes. You can lose a lot of acid in the grapes, and they just aren't as successful at making great wines. So what can you do to protect from heat waves? Some of it can be done in the moment or in the season. A lot of it is also about future planning, about site-specific decisions. So canopy management is probably the thing you can do in the moment. So if you know if there's heat wave on the horizon and you're just about to go through and prune or do suckering or leafing, there's a lot. We talked previously about ways you can make sure you get more sunlight on your fruit. A lot of times you don't want as much sunlight on your fruit because you want to protect it. You want to shade it from overheating. So there's ways of managing your canopy so that you have more cover. If you're planting your vineyard, this is where you have a lot more options because you can plant your rows with a different orientation so that throughout the day as the sun moves across the sky, it doesn't directly hit your grapes as much or your fruit zone if it's oriented in a different angle. This is where you can plant on the north side of a hillside, north facing slopes as opposed to south facing, so it gets less sun. And then you can also decide what you're actually planting. We'll talk a little bit more about this later too, but there's a lot of regions that are experimenting with different varieties, different hybrids, different grapes, and also planting on different rootstocks, again, heat resistant or drought resistant rootstocks that can help mitigate that. And then there's a lot of people that are moving higher. So more altitude or altitudinal measures are being taken, which is planting at higher elevations on mountainsides. This is happening in the Andes Mountains. It's happening in Napa, all over the place. People are trying to go at higher elevations. And one thing to be careful of is you do get less temperature, decrease in temperature at higher elevations, particularly at night. You get more of that diurnal shift. But you can have just as high temperature during the day. There's still a lot of sun intensity and sunlight at higher elevations. You actually get, I think, 10 to 12% more UV light every 1,000 feet you go up. So sunlight's still a big deal. You also have less, you might have less water. So there's a water source. There's a lot of things that will affect whether you can successfully go higher. And then in places like Napa, you have your inversion layer, which creates a level of fog at a certain point. I think it's between 16 and 1800 feet is where the inversion layer is in Napa, where it's actually cooler on the vineyard floor because they're protected during part of the day by the fog because of the moisture coming in from the San Pablo Bay. So there's different, this is a broad brush stroke about altitude. There's going to be different issues based on where in the world you are. The other thing, which is kind of the exciting part, if you were to take a positive take on climate change or global warming, is that there's now more places on the world where you can grow grapes. So more latitude. If we talked about altitude, you can now plant above the 50th parallel. So for a long time, people thought between the 30th and 50th parallel in both hemispheres was perfect for wine, which it was. But as the temperature goes up, you can start planting in places like England, the UK, Denmark, Sweden. There's even grapes on the 61st parallel in Norway, which when you think about it is the same as Anchorage, Alaska, which blows my mind. There's also a lot being done in Poland and Russia, just a lot of places that traditionally you wouldn't be able to grow grapes, but now you're starting to see more wine made there. I was actually talking to someone recently who judges sparkling wine competitions in Europe, and one of the most impressive wines he tasted was actually a Denmark sparkling wine. So they're happening now. People are making these wines now, and it's only going to continue. A lot of times these are hybrids or a lot of them made in Germany actually to be cold weather proof or cold weather resistant hybrids. But you are starting to see more Vitis vinifera varieties like Riesling and things like that grown in Norway and Sweden. Just amazing. So a couple other issues or things to watch out for. Hailstorms. So what are hailstorms? Obviously, this is when you have a thunderstorm and water freezes in the upper part of the clouds of the thunderstorm. But what happens is as it freezes, it starts to fall because it's too heavy. But there's such a huge updraft of wind that it pushes those frozen droplets up more, and they get more frozen. It hits more water, those freeze. That keeps happening until they reach a certain size that they're now just too big, and they will fall to the ground as hail. And that's why we get hail during thunderstorms. But why is this worse now? How is climate change impacting them? So hail actually is less frequent now than it used to be, but they are more intense. And there's some research to say that it's getting worse in places like Europe and Australia. It's actually being less frequent. It's not as bad in North America and other parts of the world, like East Asia. Um, but again, this goes back to just that instability. So there's with more moisture in the air and hotter temperatures, there's just a lot more instability and unpredictable weather, which can cause really bad thunderstorms. But what's interesting is there's actually a higher melting level. So a melting level is literally, if you think about it in the sky, there's a line at which the temperature is warm enough that if hail does drop through it, by the time it reaches the ground, it will have melted away into just water droplets. It won't still be ice. And the higher that melting level goes, because of higher temperatures, the less chance hail will actually reach the ground. So that's kind of nice. That's kind of good to know that we might not get the same kind of hail. But at the same time, um, hailstones are getting larger because some of these storms are getting bigger and things are happening in very unpredictable ways. But the biggest detriment, the hardest part about it for vineyards is that these events are happening um, at in your springtime and late fall when they normally wouldn't be happening. And this is when we're getting the most damage in vineyards. Obviously, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. Hail is a really hard thing to study because it's not something you can prepare for. So, with a lot of different weather events, you can prepare. Hail kind of just happens. And so you're not prepared with mats or other ways to really measure them and study them. So it's taken a long time for weather researchers and climatologists to study hail. But what can be done in the vineyard to help prevent damage? The big one is hail netting, which is like you see, it can be either a netting structure that can go over your entire vineyard, or even on the vine itself. And even on the vines or on the lines themselves, they can be positioned at fruit zone or canopy or both. So there's a lot of different variations of hail netting. And this protects from the larger hail. It also protects from birds and large insects like wasps, which can be good. But they can also add shade when you might not want shade, which can stall photosynthesis. They obviously can be expensive to install, and they don't work on certain vine training systems. So the gobelet, that bush vine, or the goblet style training systems, like in Ribera Sacra and Beaujolais and Rhone Valley, it doesn't really make sense to do hail nets over those kind of trainings. And yet those are some of the places that are getting hammered with hail year after year recently. So it's been really hard. And again, one of the other things you can do is just pray, just hope that it doesn't happen to you. Frost. So what is frost? Frost is when the temperature drops below freezing after green growth has started happening. So after the plant has woken up and the bud is burst and green growth is happening, if the temperature drops below freezing, we have frost. But there's actually two kinds of frost. You have advective, or hoarfrost, I think is another word for it, which is when you have cold air systems that blow, that there's literally wind that push it into an area, and then it freezes the vine or freezes growth. And then you also have radiational, which is sort of, I guess, the normal kind of frost, which is when you have, there's no wind, it's just cold nights, and the heat from the earth is evaporating and radiating, which drops the temperature on the surface. And as soon as it drops below that threshold, that 32-degree threshold, you have frozen growth or frozen green parts of the plant. And how is this affected by climate change? This is more about the shift in season. So with rising temperatures in late winter and early spring, a lot of times you'll get more false springs, or when plants think they can wake up and go. I know I was just talking to family in Vermont who just had snow today, so I'm sure there's some issues with plants that are trying to grow, and they finally have blossoms and growth and green, really delicate green growth on their plants, and all of a sudden they're frozen or attacked by snow, and that can be detrimental to the plant. So this is just happening more often because that fall spring is happening in certain parts of the country. It happens a little more in maritime and coastal areas. The picture you're looking at right now is actually Bordeaux. So this is this year. So in 2021, there's been some really bad frost this spring. And actually the French, the INAO, or the French groups that are responsible for marketing or talking about French wine, said that it's probably up to a third of all French wine this year is going to be destroyed because of frost, because of these spring frosts. And what you see is one of the things we'll talk about next. All those little lights along the hill are smudge pots. So ways that you can mitigate or protect your vineyard from frost. A lot of things. Again, going back to site selection, if you have the ability to plant vineyards and you're thinking ahead of when if there could be frost, you can make sure that you're planting on the right part of the slope, not too low because cold air does flow downward, so you don't want to be in the low valleys, the low hanging parts of the vineyard. You want to be on somewhere up on the ridge, and you also want to avoid air dams, or if there's, if you're on the good part of the ridge but you have a row of trees or bushes there, that can actually trap some of that cold air and keep frost circulating in your vineyard. So things like that. Sprinklers, like what you see in this picture, is a very common method. So if you run your sprinklers for a while before frost events, if you know frost is coming, it can freeze on the vines and actually insulate them, which helps protect the plant from those colder weathers. Smudge pots, like we saw in the picture before, are these small fires or large candles. They're literally just bowls of wax that you can light to keep the temperature in the vineyards a little bit higher so that they won't freeze. And then they also use wind machines or helicopters. You might have seen this if you've ever traveled through different wine regions and that deals with frost. You might see these huge turbines or wind machines. And that's really just with the radiational or radiative frost, where they're trying to mix some of that hotter air above the cool air on the surface so that it doesn't get too cold on the vines. And again, prayer. So the last thing, so other disasters that might happen: hurricanes, cyclones, derechos. We had the derecho in Iowa this past year, which was insane. But it's basically just high wind systems. Winds can damage fruit, especially if it's close to harvest. So if you think about Virginia, our hurricane season, as far as the U.S. hurricane season in the fall, we do get some impacts in Virginia and even the Long Island, like in New York, and where they're growing a lot of really great grapes now too. That can damage fruit. And what happens with high winds, if you do get berries split or if berries get damaged, it can start fermentation ahead of time, which is not good. It can aid in the development of VA, or volatile acidity, because of the splitting berries. And it can also leave them prone to rot, which is never a good thing. A longer term worry is sea level rise. Climate change, if it causes more melting at the poles and the Greenland ice shelf and things like that, as slowly as sea levels rise. There are certain areas like in Bordeaux, in Marlborough, New Zealand, that could be affected by that, but we're still a pretty long way off from that. And then the pest and disease pressure. So this kind of goes back to the beginning of talking about winter. With warmer winters, there's less chance that pests will be killed during that season. Pests will have more reproductive cycles throughout the growing season or throughout the year. One of the big ones right now is Pierce's disease in the southwestern United States. So Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico is really dealing with this. This is a disease that's spread by sharpshooters, which is kind of insects. That's really been increasing in the last couple of years. But then UC Davis actually just released 5 new varieties that are resistant to Pierce's disease. So these are some of those varieties that they finally have released into the world. This has been something they've been working on for a long time, to finally have these varieties, these Errante Noir, Ambulo Blanc, that can kind of mimic some of the nicer Cabernet, Syrah, Grenache, those kind of varieties grown in those same places. So what are the challenges for winemakers? A lot of those same issues for growers is what winemakers have to deal with, because the winemakers are still the ones mostly in charge of when they decide to pick. And so to avoid overripeness, we are picking earlier. A lot of them are sourcing from vineyards in cooler sites or north-facing slopes. There are certain things you can do in the cellar to mitigate overripeness or higher alcohol, like water and acid additions. There's even more crazy expensive processes like centrifuges, reverse osmosis, which we don't do any of that stuff. That's a little insane. But there are ways for big wineries in order to have wines that aren't overripe. And then you also have to make sure, depending on where you are, that you do have enough water for winemaking, which can be a problem in places where there are diminishing reservoirs. And then as far as business, this was one example, but I thought it was interesting to share. So in France, in eastern France, in the Savoie region, it's a region that grows some amazing wines, or amazing grapes. They make amazing wines, but a lot of their wines are sold to the Alps, to the Swiss Alps, and these villages that have ski resorts, really fancy resorts, and that's a big part of their market. But since the 1970s, the Swiss Alps, or the Alpine skiing season, has shrunk by 35 days. Because of climate change, because of the warming temperature. And when you have a market that's 35 days less than it usually is, you have to find different places to sell your wine. So they are starting to sell their wines in different markets and having to shift where they're selling their wines. And that's happening all over the place. People are trying to find different places to sell wines when certain industries dry up or certain markets dry up. A big thing I'm interested about, and we can even talk more about this if some of you have questions, is how consumers will actually change the market or change the wine business. It's interesting to think that, are people going to cling to these varieties that we know, the Pinot, the Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, that we've known for a long time? Will people still want to buy those wines even though the style might change because the temperature's getting warmer, and maybe they're going to be riper, more boozy versions of what we knew them as? Or are they going to be okay with getting on board with new varieties like Nero d'Avola or Fiano or any of these other Mediterranean grapes that people are starting to experiment with that are better suited for heat? Are people going to be okay with just new crazy blends of hybrids and crossings like these ones made by UC Davis? And then how long will it take too? Will people's taste change, or will people still want those same types of wines that have been made over the last couple of decades? And then in certain parts of the world, particularly the EU, there's going to be some laws that might need to be changed, because in a lot of places they're not allowed to irrigate, they're not allowed to grow certain grapes. Actually, Bordeaux just this year approved 7 new varieties of grapes to grow because of climate change. So for a long time there was the only 6 red grapes they could grow. They just added Touriga Nacional, which is a Portuguese grape. They added another Castex, Marcelon, and some other grape I can't pronounce. But there are regions that are starting to pass laws and change things in order to adapt and sort of have a longer view of what's going to happen. And then also it'll be interesting to see how the wine industry responds to transparency demands. It's apparent in a lot of things now that people want to know what's in the food they eat, what's in the drinks they drink. So are there going to be new labeling laws that will actually tell you exactly what ingredients have gone in, what sort of additives and things have people made or added to make sure the wine tastes the way you think it's going to taste? So that'll be interesting. And then also, is there going to be more alternative packaging like canned wines, kegged wine? I did see a paper bottle advertised online where they're selling, it's literally a bottle made from recycled paper. So you never know. There's lots of different things that they could do. And these are just final thoughts to get us going in a conversation. For the wine industry, the overarching goal is to create a resilient industry. We're still probably we're many years away from dealing with some of the more extreme mitigation techniques and growing completely different grapes in completely different regions. But the goal is to make sure we can still make wine, sell wine, that people will still enjoy wine. And then it's important to know this isn't, a pass-fail problem. If we miss these targets, so, the IPCC has recommended that we should try to keep warming only to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial eras, maybe 2, most likely will be above 2 based on how things are going. But even if we get up to 4 degrees, which would be devastating, there's still things we can do. We can still take mitigative and adaptive measures to deal with this and still produce wine. And then lastly, grape growers, I think by definition, are already pretty adaptable. More than many other crops in many other industries, we are constantly adjusting to year-to-year vintage variation. And I think that more than a lot of people, I think growers and winemakers will be able to figure out how to do this. And then lastly, and I'll include this in the fact check or our follow-up, there are some organizations that are tackling this issue in the wine industry. There's a conference held every 2 years in Montreal called Tasting Climate Change, which is pretty interesting, trying to encourage more producers to go carbon neutral. And then the International Wineries for Climate Action is a similar type group. But again, I will include that later. So oh boy, that was a lot of information. How are you feeling about that? It's for me, it's been I've been paying attention to climate change and just some of these issues for a long time now. Actually, and trying to listen to more podcasts and just reading up on some of these things because it is a pretty important topic. Um, but but yeah, at this point, if you do have any questions about anything you heard or what sort of what we're doing, then now is the time to ask away.
Eli,
Yeah.
um, of those difficulties with climate, which ones have affected where you get your grapes from for Avennia? I mean, have there been any wildfires in that area or a lot of frost? Which one do you deal with the most?
Yeah, not as much frost, but wildfires I think is definitely the thing we've worried about the most. Washington, even in doing some of the research on the changes in temperature and droughts and things like that, the Pacific Northwest isn't as affected as places like California and some of the lower latitudes, which is a relief I think for us for our industry here. But fire is definitely something that we've been worried about. 2013 and 2017 were the two last really bad vintages for fire in Washington. And even this past year, that there's a lot of worry about some of the sourcing. But what's hard about it is just again, you don't really know unless you do lab results um, how it's going to affect your wines. And luckily we have really great relationships with all of our growers, and they've been really transparent and upfront about any risks like that. So we know that if we need to test anything, but we know other producers that have struggled and had to get rid of a lot of the wine or try to sell off some of the wine because it's just not adequate. It's not ready to, or you won't be able to sell it because it'll taste smoky. So that's definitely been like the hardest one.
Have you ever tasted smoke?
Have I
Have
ever?
you ever tasted smoke taint?
Yeah, I think I've tasted it. Because I think I think it was 2013 also, or 2008 maybe in Sonoma. There was other years, and I've tasted Pinots from Sonoma from smoke years that had smoke taint in them before. Um, Honestly, a lot of times they do catch it with enough time um, to either just get it out of the market, or you have very very bold marketing and wineries and people that are just going to put barbecue wine on the label and hope for the best. So you can definitely find wine out there that is smoke tainted, and they'll find a way to sell it, which in some ways it's good for them. Like if you can find a way to sell your wine, even if it's tainted or faulted, then that's great. It's still a business. So, but yeah, I've tasted a couple that from Pinots from Sonoma that I think were smoke tainted. Mark, let me ask, what does wine made from grapes with smoke taint taste like? Is there any special wine product with smoky flavors like smoky flavors in Scottish whiskies? So it's a good question. The compound, the aromatic compound that smoke taint is derived from is guaiacol, or in different versions of guaiacol. And guaiacol is naturally occurring in a lot of different grapes. So it's the same thing that might give you, the smoked meat taste in a Syrah, say that has levels of glycol. It's a similar. You'll get the same kind of thing from barrels, from charred barrels. You'll get that same glycol. But it's the certain level of it. It's the size of the compounds themselves that can make it taste more intensely like smoke. Um, but yeah, but there, I, speaking from experience, I actually really like smoky flavored things. I like smoky whiskeys, smoked barbecue meats, even beer, like Rausch beer that has smoked malt in it. Like I really like smoky flavors. So for me, it's not as a negative flavor, but I can definitely see like in certain wines, you're not going to want smoke. You're not going to want smoke in a Riesling. That just might not taste very nice. So, oh, Casey has a joke. With the new vine approvals in Bordeaux, are you going to have to add vines to the Avennia logo now? That's good. That's funny. Maybe we should. No, and it's funny because it's very much brand new. The Bordeaux growers and people that were asking to be able to add grapes have been asking since 2019, at least officially. They officially applied to have these new grape varieties approved in Bordeaux. they've been researching for the last 10 years, though, about which grapes can grow well in Bordeaux and lend something to the blend to make them a little more consistent. And so they actually tried over 50 different varieties, some of them hybrids, some of them ancient varieties, and they landed on those seven, those four, or is there six? There's actually only six. There's four reds and two whites. And it was interesting. One of the white wines that they approved was Albarino, which you'll recognize is from Spain. So that same grape is now going to be legally allowed in Bordeaux. Touriga Nacional, like I said, from Portugal and port production, but they're still in very small quantities. They can only actually make up I think it's 5% of the blend or 10% of the planting. So of your vineyards, only 10% of your vines can actually be these new varieties. One of the varieties they really wanted to approve was called Petit Manseng, which is a white grape, and it proved to be really great for that climate. They thought it would be a really good addition, but they actually couldn't end up approving it because the INAO has rules about you can't approve a grape in one region of France when it's already well established in another region. And Petit Manseng is one of the main grapes of southwest France and in certain areas in near the Pyrenees. And so they have laws that are like, well, it's basically the same thing. Like they'd never be able to approve Pinot Noir in any other region or in Bordeaux because Burgundy already has that well established, or vice versa. Burgundy will never approve Merlot because of that. So, the French. Yeah, Mary Margaret.
Um, you mentioned UV at one point. Does like a higher UV have the same effect as a higher temperature? And how does that figure into ripening and other aspects of growing?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how much it affects temperature. From my understanding, the level of UV more affects the skins, and it causes the skins to grow thicker because it wants to protect the fruit from UV rays. So, and I can look up the actual science behind it, but because I know in Napa, one of the benefits of mountain fruit, when they talk about valley fruit versus mountain fruit, or valley Cabernet versus mountain Cabernet, a lot of mountain Cabernets will have more tannins because the skins are thicker because there's more UV light penetrating the grapes. So I think it's more related. It's a defense mechanism from the grape to grow thicker skins to protect it from UV light the further you go in altitude. But there might be some other parts of that equation. But that's what I remember in the moment. So yeah, well, just crazy. I know I talked for too long. Part of this, I feel bad because part of it is creating, because we record these and we get to post them as videos. In some ways, it's a way to get all this information out for people to watch it if they haven't watched. So that's why this maybe ran a little longer than normal. But if none of you have any other questions, I guess I can wrap things up here for you. Next couple weeks, so the next 3 weeks actually are all going to be interviews. I'm really, really excited about the next 3 weeks. Next week, I'll be joined by Chris Horn, who is my old boss. He's an amazing sommelier in Seattle, and he's a particularly gifted in food and wine pairing. So we're going to be pairing our new releases, our whites and rosé. We're not going to actually physically pair them with food, but we're going to talk about them and how white wines pair with food and sort of get his crazy brain into the mix. And then the week after that, on May 6th, I'll be talking to Erica Orr, an incredible winemaker. She also runs a lab that does a lot of these testings on grapes for all different winemakers. So if you have your science questions, she's definitely a good person to ask about that. And then the week after that is going to be Lacey Liebeck. She's the vineyard manager at Sagemore Farms, where we source a bunch of our fruit for Cabernet, but also Roussanne and Cabernet Franc. So she'll be a good person to ask a lot of viticultural questions to and vine questions. And I think she's going to be able to share some pictures of the vineyards we source from and where they are in the season, like in their growth period in May. So yeah, hope to see you all in the next couple of weeks. Enjoy the sun if you have it. I'm sorry if you have snow and rain. It's definitely time for good weather, but happy Earth Day. Thanks for joining, and I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. If you wanted to unmute just to say goodbye, I always love hearing your voices. So thanks, everyone.
Happy
Thanks,
Earth
Eli.
Day.
This was
Bye.
great.
Thanks, Eli. Good job.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.